Hello, my name is Samantha Deloy, and I did my research on military trauma. The unique problems associated with this population is combat trauma, physical trauma, and moral injury, which we will discuss in the next slides. Combat trauma. Combat trauma or war trauma refers to the psychological damage received from the stressors of military conflict. So anything regarding explosions, dealing with, foes, anything along the lines that is a traumatic event, can cause combat trauma. And it doesn't even have to be the experience itself. Like if someone's experiencing the event, it could just be seeing it, could be witnessing it. That can also cause combat trauma. The symptoms with combat trauma include, and not limited to, flashbacks, nightmares, severe anxiety, complicated grief, depending on, someone that might have died in their eyes, or um, maybe it was a friend, could have been another soldier, could have been a child, depending on the event. These common symptoms can cause or have a contribution to mental health diagnoses. So with combat trauma, it can be PTSD, depression, TBI, which is more physical, but also cognitive, um, and other mental health problems. So I liked Hall's quote when he said that sometimes the soldier must act not even knowing who the enemy is, as they are hidden amongst innocent non-combatants, and any street or house may be a lethal booby trap. So really, it just shows, depending on the experience that the veteran goes through, or the soldier goes through, can really impact the mind. Okay. Physical trauma is the next one. Physical trauma refers to injuries obtained during training, deployment, and the psychological mark it left on the veteran due to what took place. So again, it is an event, it is an experience, more so experiencing it, because with physical trauma, it's going to be something that happened to them physically. So it's going to be getting shot. It's going to be shrapnel. It's going to be an explosion or having an amputation because the leg is no longer functional, or it is infected, depending on the event. With physical trauma, it can cause psychological stressors. It can cause psychological symptoms and mental health issues, which then leads to a diagnosis later on when they do come back to the civilian life and do get diagnosed. Um, Within a study that looked at soldiers that were deployed in Afghanistan and Iraq, they did a positive mental health screening, and they found out that nearly twofold of soldiers that were deployed had a mental health symptoms and could be screened for a diagnosis. Like, that's how terrible the event and the exposure that they had, made that scar, made that um, impediment on their cognitive being. Moral injury. Moral injury it creates a profound emotional and psychological wound caused by actions or experiences that violate an individual's moral or ethical code. So this could be you have an event that is transpiring and it's the fight or flight response, and it could be maybe they acted immorally because of the reaction that happened, because they were surprised, because, something was around the corner, like Hall said previously in the combat trauma section. It depends on what is transpiring, or maybe it wasn't what they decided. It might have been, a superior telling them what to do, and they didn't ethically or morally line up with that. And now they're looking at themselves later on in the civilian life and saying to them, why did I do this? And they're just beating themselves up because of the decision that was made during deployment. And this could also be in training, could also be, with physical trauma and moral injury, it could be within the trainings as well. So, with moral injury, it can form an array of symptoms, but it can also form PTSD, major depressive disorder, and chronic pain. It is MI symptoms are positively associated with PTSD and MDD. And another source I had said that, it can cause chronic pain as well. So, moral injury does a lot more than we think initially when we hear it just being it's not lining up with our ethical code. It can do a lot more damage in long term than a lot of people realize. So PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, we're going into the diagnosis now of what military trauma can ensue in veterans and soldiers. So with PTSD, it is the most common diagnosis that is given to veterans. Comes up in many research searches. So basically, PTSD is a mental health diagnosis that develops after an individual experiences or witnesses a traumatic event. Okay, so we know them to be, the symptoms to have to be flashbacks, nightmares, emotional distress. It is the most common, again, it is the most common diagnosis for veterans post-deployment, so after deployment. Because again, it goes back to the physical trauma, it goes back to the combat trauma, it goes back to moral injury, the event that took place, the experience they had, or what they witnessed, either deployment or in training, can harshly affect their cognitive well-being. Even through the physical, PTSD can ensue. However, there are treatments available to veterans and soldiers that have this diagnosis. So a very popular organization, the Veteran Affairs, they have services that really go after treating PTSD, which include cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, or my favorite is EMDR, the eye movement desensitization and reprocessing treatment options. So reprocessing using the eye movement and has shown so much positive feedback from veterans, and it is a newer one than CBT or DBT or any of those, and that have created positive effects for veterans and treating PTSD. So depression. Depression arises among veterans from military trauma and can have lasting effects based on the traumatic event experience. So it always goes back to the traumatic event. So major depressive disorder, or MDD, encompasses psychological, physical, and behavioral symptoms. So what I had found in one study was from actually a Canadian perspective. And what it was for those that were deployed in Afghanistan after deployment, the prevalence of major depression was 48.9%, including PTSD, which was 12.8%. Now, a lot of them did have prior diagnoses before, and they skyrocketed during deployment. So understanding the effects of war, understanding the effects of training on a veteran is paramount to them receiving treatment and understanding their options when they do come back as a civilian. The next one we have is traumatic brain injury, also known as TBI. It is a neurological diagnosis that impairs a veteran's psychological, cognitive, and motor functions. So a lot of times with TBI, it really does depend on the event that ensued on the individual. So a lot of times it is a concussive blow to the head that renders the individual not being able to communicate as well, not being able to hear, being dizzy. These factors or memory issues or irritability, anger was one, PTSD and isolation. So isolating yourself from from others, from the world because you're no longer the self that you once were before you were deployed or before you went to training because of the traumatic event that happened that enabled you to remember or enabled you to communicate or enabled you to speak properly. So that's why there are so many treatments available for TBI because of the broadness and the different amounts of ways that TBI can hurt a veteran. There's moderate to severe levels. So it really does depend on the event that happened and how they were, how their head was hurt. So the rehabilitation process for veterans with TBI requires a specific approach to address psychological, physical, social, and vocational recovery needs. So again, there's many vast different treatment options for TBI because of what happened and how the brain encompasses the whole self. I mean, that's how we function, that's how we talk, that's how we are as human beings. So you hurt the brain, there's going to be something going on there. So depending on what it is, treatments are available for TBI. So now we go to the impact of military trauma on family members and supportive caregivers. So now we're going into the home now, rather than the individual. So the impacts that can happen. So even during deployment or during training, there's marital strains, there's financial challenges, there are mental health and physical health challenges that both the spouse and the veteran can have once they return home, because it is a transition. It is a transition from, having that military culture and coming back into the civilian world. It is different. It is, you don't have a schedule anymore. You're doing what you want. You're in your own household again. It is a different environment. And, that veteran is no longer, I mean, they are themselves, but they have changed in some regard. And depending on if they, have symptoms of MDD or have symptoms of PTSD or TBI, whatever it is, it can have a strain on a marital relationship. It can have challenges with finances and remembering how to do that. And for the spouse as well, for her to understand, how to conduct finances appropriately while the spouse is out serving our country. So, there are sacrifices being made within the household. And once they leave and once they return, can have impacts on the family environment and the communication that is there. However, there are supportive services that can help with all of these challenges within the home. And they are holistic services. They are spiritual groups and services, psychological services and coping strategies, social support groups. A lot of these things can help them reintegrate into civilian life and find again what it means to be dad, what it means to be a husband again. Not that they ever lost that notion, not that they ever thought that they weren't going to have that when they came back, but because of the challenges that they now face cognitively, physically, moral injury, so those things need to be processed. And for those to be processed and understand where an individual is now at, we need to look at supportive services for them to heal the whole self so that they can prosper and live a life with their family. And that includes, supporting their family, supporting their children, their wife, and so forth.
Many times veterans come to us in very vulnerable positions. It is our honor and privilege to serve them and give them the tools necessary to be successful.
So not every crisis is the same. Sometimes you need someone to talk to. Sometimes you're going to need supportive services. Social workers take into account things like your health, living situation, and your military experience. Those are things you aren't gonna get from a video on the internet.
As social workers, we can implement a holistic point of view where we can service the veteran from a mental, physical, and spiritual point of view.
So the video encompasses what social work interventions mean and what they do for veterans when they come back to civilian life. With that being said, there are different levels, as we know, within social work. So we have the micro, the meso, and the macro levels. Within the micro levels, we have the facilitation of psychotherapy sessions for veterans' mental health. So we have the individualized treatment plans that help them understand their self, help them understand where they are at cognitively, physically, morally, with the whole military trauma. Because military trauma is not just one thing, it encompasses a vast amount of different diagnoses, symptoms, thoughts. It encompasses the whole trauma that was based in deployment or within training. So it is important to sit down with a clinician and talk about what needs to be addressed. Being diagnosed is important so that you can continue and learn coping skills and be in a mode of wanting to recover so that one day you will recover or one day you will have a better understanding of how to cope so that you can live your life to the fullest. That is for a soldier, that is for a veteran. Moving forward to the meso level, the conducting of group and family therapy practices to address emotional, behavioral, and mental health needs. So in a group setting is so important because it gives a perspective others need to hear. So for veterans, they need to acknowledge that they are not alone. This is not something that is just happening to them, that there are other, brothers in arms that have had this happen to them and they're experiencing similar things like PTSD, MDD, or TBI, and fostering that connection can also support with social, having a community of people, finding friends, these things that help us come together to build a community that fosters hope. And then also it addresses family therapy practices to address these things. It's important for the family to understand what's happening and including how, the veteran might need help communicating those things. So having the whole family come together and understanding, what needs to happen for dad or for, the husband or whatever the dynamic is, it can be a very therapeutic way of healing the family. At the macro level, social workers advocate for veterans to gather valuable resources to support them and their families. The advocacy is so important so that the veteran understands what his options are and understands where he can go for different things. And to have the veteran get in the door in the first place, that advocacy is there so that that veteran can get what he or she needs. So all of these things are very important, and social workers do so much more than just, you know, the examples that I have given within this slide. So social workers are definitely needed in the realm of the military, because they foster hope and they do give supportive services for veterans that need it the most. So accessing services. So we talked about the intervention. So now we're going to the access to services. So, you know, there are barriers within a veteran's mindset and within their environment. So we have military culture stigma. So the culture itself is, I'm only going to rely on myself and my brothers in arms, my unit, and going from that to civilian life, there's a switch that needs to occur, but it cannot occur because of how much it has been ingrained and it is a part of their self. It is a part of their own culture, right? So, and the stigma of, you know, if you get help, you're weak, you got to have a stiff chin and you got this, and this grit that makes you a part of the military, you know. So changing that perspective can take time and can hurt them accessing resources that will be a benefit to them. Another one is geographical location. If they're, you know, way out in, you know, on the farmlands or, you know, wherever they might be, they may not be close to a VA. They may not be close to a bigger community with a lot of services. You know, maybe it's a smaller town. So that is a barrier when it comes to transportation for them to find services that will help them in their physical or mental health. Being unaware of benefits is a big one because a lot of times veterans don't understand that they are eligible for certain benefits, and you know, being aware of that can change someone's life. Financial constraints. So, you know, leaving the home and coming back, there might be financial constraints. So maybe they, you know, maybe they're unaware or maybe they don't have the finances to get the treatment they need because maybe they don't have benefits. Right? So it just really depends on the dynamic of the home and the dynamic of the family and what has occurred since that person was deployed versus now what he or she is home. So it really just depend on the financial part as well. But there are resources to gain access to these services if we know where to look. So there's community services, there's social services, social support groups, and spiritual groups and services. All these groups and services promote hope, promote coming back into civilian life and understanding, you know, what that is, and fostering, you know, better a better sense of belonging. And I think that's the biggest thing when it comes to veterans because they have lost their unit and now they are home, and maybe their unit has now their family, but maybe that's a struggle for them because of the culture that was, you know, placed within them. So all these services and groups will be most helpful to them in recovering and understanding that they have a belonging here, in their home. And that is my presentation.